Green Week, which runs until, oh, sorry. I should have remembered to say this. This meeting will be recorded. So if everyone's okay with that, please keep your cameras on. If not, you're absolutely free to turn your cameras off.
Can I get access to a copy of that afterwards?
Yeah, of course.
Well, okay, we'll follow up on that later.
Okay, brilliant. So yes, this talk is part of Croydon Climate Action's Great Big Green Week, which runs until this Sunday the 26th, and which we will be posting details of in the chat shortly. So to this evening's event, today we're very lucky to have Colin Hastings with us. Colin is an organisational psychologist and author of 3 practical self-help management books. Forgive the London sirens in the background. Through much research, Colin has used that pretty much all of us can play a role in helping to create a permanent and radical reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Colin's step-by-step behavioural approach is the subject of his latest book, The Carbon Buddy Manual, which is the topic of today's talk. We actually were able to get in contact with Colin through one of our steering committee members, Connie, who actually found out about this book, reached out to Colin on Twitter, and that is how this relationship was formed. So the Carbon Buddy Manual is a step-by-step guide to turning all of our good intentions into positive actions. So as we all know, radical action is needed very, very quickly in order to deal with the current situation that we're in. The book is split into 12 different chapters, which I'm sure Colin will be talking about. And I think I've covered most things. So I'll hand over to Colin. If I could just ask everyone to please make sure that they're muted whilst Colin is talking. And I'm sure there'll be time for questions at the end, which is great. If you've also got questions that you don't want to forget, please make sure you're putting them in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Thank you very much, Colin. I'll pass over to you now.
Brilliant. So you're going to make me host, and then I'm going to be sharing a screen with you in a second.
You can
I think you should already be able to share your screen.
I can share screen now, can I?
Yes.
Okay, let me just do that. Well, I just before I sort of bung a PowerPoint slides in front of you, just to say how thrilled I am on all sorts of counts, because this has been quite a long time in the planning, and I've been in conversation with the group in Croydon, who have been very active and proactive and kind in enabling this to happen, and also being generous in making it open to people outside of Croydon, which I think makes it a rather special coming together of people, and as we will see shortly, people all around the world. So I'm going to kick off. Let me just get my screen up and make sure that you can all see that properly. Can everybody see that reasonably? Can I have some thumbs ups? Just
yeah,
so you
can see it. If you press present, you should be able to get.
Yes, sometimes I quite like to see what's coming on the side, but if it's better for you, I can do that one. Is that better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, well, let's crack on there. Okay, so we have clearly a number of people in Croydon. We also have some people in Cornwall. We've got the editor of the manual, Caroline, who I saw sitting there, and also somebody who I haven't yet met, who I'd like to say a virtual hello to, who is Emma from the Cornwall Energy Partnership. And they're a local organisation that helps people with some of the minefields involved. And then, as you've probably gathered already, we have some people from Boise in Idaho in the United States of America. And in particular, I want to single out John Warren, who you heard talking earlier on there, who has been an absolute rock and a great ally and friend in helping me to begin to think about spreading these ideas in the United States. John is a real doer, and as you'll see, I like doers. So I also wondered, have we got anybody from anywhere else that we haven't covered? Is there anybody from some other interesting place who'd like to just say hello. They're not immediately showing. Okay, well, look, let's crack on. And I'm going to just move that over there, if I may. We haven't got a lot of time tonight, but also I think, as Omar put in his introduction, we haven't got a lot of time to solve this climate crisis that we all face. And in the time that I have with you tonight, I really want to inspire you, if I can, to discover some greater degree of resolve. I mean, by definition, you've all got some degrees of resolve already because you're here and you've taken this first step. Many of you have taken lots of other steps. But I guess if I can inspire you and through you other people to take this all more seriously, to be more confident about taking action, and as you'll see as I talk through, to be even more ambitious in terms of what you do and what you try to make happen. A rough overview, I'm going to cover these topics. Sorry, I'm just trying to put a timer on and it's not behaving itself. I'll sort that later. Sorry, technical problems here. I'll sort it later. Okay, I want to talk very briefly about my mindset, where I'm coming from, and perhaps what makes my approach rather different from a lot of what you hear. I'll do a very quick overview of the state of climate action. Many of you will know a lot of that, but I think it's worth just doing a quick summary of where we are in the process of responding to these massive problems. I'll make a case for a different approach from a lot of the approaches that are happening currently and have happened historically. And because you're all, I think, or most of you are in one way or other involved with a local climate action group, I want to just give you some thoughts about what I think it takes to make an effective climate group work properly. So my mindset, I am not a climate scientist. As in the introduction, I said, I'm an organisational psychologist. People at that point usually blur over and think, what on earth is one of those? And very broadly, I spent a lot of my time teaching in a business school and then working as a consultant with all sorts of organisations, helping them with the process of change and behaviour change in organisations. As the world around those organisations changed, the strategy had to change, and therefore people's behavior had to change to respond to that, to keep the organization alive and vibrant. And my particular specialism, and the subject of a lot of my books, is about high-performing teams, because team working is a crucial part of bringing about change. You can't really do change by yourself unless you're some kind of superhuman person. In parallel with that, I am a climate doer. I get quite impatient with people who talk all the time and don't do things. And my wife and I have spent 12 years, it sounds crazy, but we've spent 12 years trying to do a whole range of things to reduce our carbon footprint. We are very lucky people in the sense that we are fortunate and we have both skills and we have the resources to be able to, in a sense, be early adopters of a number of things. And that is partially helped by my son, who has a degree in renewable energy and is very, very involved at quite a senior level in the UK government now with responses to the future of energy in this country. So what I've seen and what I've experienced for myself is the practical realities of what's involved in trying to do all this stuff that everybody is telling us we ought to do. And it ain't easy. That's, I think, one of the big things that I've learned. It is really not that easy. So let's take a quick take stock of where we're at. We all know that to respond to these great challenges is going to require behavior change on the part of individuals. There's going to be technological change, there's going to be political change, there's going to be system change, but at the end of the day, each of us as citizens is going to have to change our behavior in one way or the other. And when you're thinking about change, a very simple way of thinking about it is in terms of drivers and obstacles. There's the green arrows, in a sense, that are the factors that are helping the change along, or indeed sometimes forcing the change along. And then there are the obstacles, the things that are getting in the way. And we tend to get a sort of a status quo, which is when those two forces are kind of equal and opposite, if you like. But the problem is that when we want to bring about change, we need to change that status quo. And I just represent it with this little graphic. If you just sort of have a look, it gets a bit uncomfortable here. And then gradually over time, the green arrows bring about the change. Except, is it the green arrows that are bringing about change? Or is it actually the reduction in the red arrows? And that's a key idea I want to leave with you. When we think about change, we think must push harder, must tell people what to do, must lecture people, must, do all of that proactive stuff, push. But actually what we've learned from change is that if you do only that, all you succeed in doing is increasing the resisting forces. And to bring about change, particularly on a large scale, we have to understand and get to understand what those obstacles are that are holding people back from change. We tend to pillory people who are resistant to change, but actually skilled change makers get to understand the reasons behind that. They respect the reasons behind it, and they say, okay, how can we work to reduce those obstacles, to make the change easier, more acceptable, whatever you want. So drivers is the good news, and I'm going to talk a bit more about those. More people now think it's important. All the surveys have shown that over the last several years, and I would say particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a rising graph of people saying, yep, this issue is important. And that's good news, because 5 years ago, it wasn't even on the radar and people weren't taking it seriously at all. I'll go so far as to say that the solutions are clear. We actually have the solutions already, pretty much. And all we have to do is to find ways of implementing them at scale. I'll say more about that. And if you're interested in looking into this, a very fine piece of American research is a book called Drawdown, or the Drawdown Project. If you Google that, there's a book, but also wonderful stuff online. And they've done a terrific amount of research about the range of solutions available. And most importantly, and I'll come to this in due course, which solutions can have the quickest and the biggest impact in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. And that point is incredibly important, because up until Drawdown, it wasn't terribly clear which it had the biggest impact. What we're now clear about too is the objective. It is terribly simple, this objective, but terribly difficult. And that is a rapid, substantial emissions reduction. And each of those words is important, okay? The reduction has to be substantial. We're not talking about 10% here or there. We're talking about, 50, 60% maybe over the next 10 years. And more importantly, within the next 5 years, given this kind of looming deadline of 2030, which you will all be aware of, it has to be rapid, particularly as some of the solutions, indeed quite a lot of the solutions, actually take quite a lot of time to take effect. So we have this kind of conundrum. Yes, we know the solutions, but some of them don't have much of a quick payback, or those that have a fairly quick payback are quite complicated to make happen. So the urgency of this is now very clear, and you only have to look at the latest IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change report, and they spell it out. They spell it out absolutely critically. And, that urgency is beginning to filter through. I think the arrival of COP26 in November, this big conference in Glasgow, international conference, is clearly a huge moment. And apart from the urgency, there's two kinds of urgency that we need to think about. The first of all is speeding up the impact that we get and heightening people's ambition to do things more quickly. And that means having an eye on prioritization, being very clear what the priorities need to be. I talk about that as prioritization. But then there's a second kind of urgency, which is what I'm calling scaling up. It's this idea of having an exponential growth in the numbers of people who are actually doing stuff. And as we'll see in a second, at the moment, we're not there. We don't have that. And that equally is somewhere where we need to raise our level of ambition. And that process I will refer to, and I talk about it in the manual, as propagation. It's bringing other people in and bringing them in quick. Now, at the sort of macro level, if we think of the broad drivers of change, HRH, sorry, I say HRH, that's the Prince of Wales, but probably the Americans know more about the British royal family than the Brits do. So HRH, when they had the G7 reception at the Eden Project in Cornwall, which is where I live, it became clear, he said very pithily, I thought, he said, look, we need these four things. We need political will, we need international cooperation, we need business and financial innovation, and we need the mass mobilization of individual citizens. Now, I think we can argue, you know, that the pessimists will probably want to argue with me on this, but broadly speaking, there has been a step change in the level of political will. I think, well, I won't go into the details of why that should be, but I think it's tangible. And just the very fact that Boris Johnson gave 2 speeches at the UN yesterday on purely this subject tells you something about that. International cooperation is scaling up, something that we saw the power of through the pandemic, for example. We're going to have international cooperation of all sorts to get to grips with this challenge, which is way bigger than the pandemic. Business and financial innovation, there's some really exciting things happening out there in the world of business and research and innovation. And probably even more important link to that, there is money flowing into those endeavors and into that innovation and research process, big money. And that's very, very important in this change, that the financial system is actually putting its money where its mouth is. And then the last one, the mass mobilization of individual citizens. That's where we're weak, and that's really the focus of what I'm all about. So we know where we are, we know where we're trying to get to, we know what we need to do, and we know why we need to do it. Because basically, at root, it's not about saving the planet, it's about saving humanity. The planet will be fine without us. In fact, you could argue the planet will be better without us. It is fundamentally about saving humanity as we know it. But there is a big gap. We've got those good news things, but there are some obstacles which we need to look at. And this summarizes, for me, I'm not going to go into detail here, but this is some research in the States by the Pew Research Center, which is a respected polling and research organization in the US. Similar, I guess, as far as I can make out, to Gallup and those sorts of people in the UK. Just look at the left-hand blue bars, right? Roughly high 60% of people saying climate should be top priority to ensure a sustainable planet for future generations. That is way bigger, as I said earlier on, than it used to be. But then look over here at the right-hand set of columns. We're down at what, an average 27, 28 of people who have personally taken action to help address climate change within the last year. So that's simplistic, but for me, it kind of summarizes the problem. Plenty who are aware, plenty who have the intentions, plenty who say the right things, but there are far from plenty who are actually pulling their finger out and doing stuff with the speed and the scale that is required. And that's really worrying. That is worrying. So the question is, how do we accelerate beyond awareness to effective action, if you like? And early on in the process of writing this, I was talking to more and more people, as I suppose you do when you're beginning to think about writing a book. And two words came out time and time again. I feel stuck and I feel overwhelmed. And for me, those two words told me a lot, I suppose, as a psychologist. You know, those are both feelings. They're not to do with science, and they're not to do with technology. They're not to do with politics. They are personal feelings. And they are feelings which make people feel, if you like, a bit immobilized. And nobody likes that feeling. It's a very horrible feeling, not to feel powerful enough to be able to do stuff, to feel overwhelmed. So I started looking in greater detail into what stops us from taking action, because for me, coming back to my drivers and obstacles model, right, it's those red arrows, what stops us from taking action, and how do we develop strategies for overcoming those obstacles to action. Now, this is too detailed, this slide, right, and I'm not going to go through it all, but it's just for you to have a quick gaze through, and you'll see some of the kinds of quotes that I got from interviewing people. I'll just be silent for 30 seconds while you have a quick whiz through that. Okay, you will have got the flavor. And some of them you'll say, oh boy, I recognize that. Some of them you'll say, no, that's not me, or I've never come across that. But when I began to think, okay, what can you do about that? And I looked at, I was writing books, and I started reading books, and I started getting books, and I started looking in the media, and I started seeing what the coverage was. I started seeing what the scientists were saying, and it was all those red arrows. It was push, 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 do this, do that, must do this, must do that. Here's some more information which will enable you to do what you need to do. This is going to tell you what you need to do. And it wasn't working. At the end, there's a lovely book called There Is No Planet B. And the author, whose name suddenly escapes me, of course I know it well, Tim Berners-Lee, said at the end, why is it that after 20 years of scientific information and advice going out to people, we still haven't got the level of engagement that we need to? And what that tells me is that that's not working. So if that's not working, what do we have to do differently? And that's what I set off to try and do and to find out. And I broadly would contrast the top-down process with what I'm calling a bottom-up process, driven by ordinary citizens working together at the grassroots. You know, we know how powerful citizens can be. We know how powerful people working together can be. And that is the sort of beginning of my thinking, and that's what began to find itself into the Carbon Buddy Manual photographed there. Right, let me start saying a little bit about that. I deliberately called it a manual. It is not a book. In my mind, I wrote it for people who don't read books, because certainly when I saw a lot of the climate change books that were coming out, mostly written by academics or quasi-academics, the people I know weren't reading them. And the people I talked to weren't reading them, or they started and did the first 10 pages and then they gave up. But then I thought, lots of those people read cookery books. they read motor manuals, they read instruction books, they read gardening books, but those are manuals. It's a very different kind of concept. It's a practical thing. It's broken down into bite-sized chunks, and it's not all very small print. It's laid out nicely, etc., etc. So that's what I set out to do. Could I take that concept of a manual and a practical thing, a readable thing, an approachable thing, and make it into a tool, if you like, that people would find useful? So let me just tell you a little bit about how it works. It's based around the idea of processes. Now, it doesn't actually say this in the book, and that's quite deliberate, but hidden within there are a series of processes that I found from my experience, drawing on my own consultancy experience, my teaching experience, my own practical attempts to do stuff over the last 12 years. I thought, what are the key processes that people have to go through in order to get to grips, particularly with this complexity? And there's a number of them here. Again, I won't go into it in great detail, but finding your motivation, it's not a given. How do you find that kind of inner resolve that is so important? Crucial thing, which I'll come back to, being clear about your goals. There is a lot of fuzzy thinking around in this climate change and environmental movement about goals. And I'm going to say some perhaps rather controversial things about that later on. Making this concept of greenhouse gases and pollution tangible. It was very striking for me that people jumped onto the plastics bandwagon after the David Attenborough Blue Planet programs. And I'm sure that some of that was because it made it tangible. They could see these bits of plastic in the sea. But we can't see this stuff that we're pumping out into the atmosphere. So therefore it doesn't exist. And so measuring it and learning how to measure it is perhaps one of the ways that we can begin to make it a bit more concrete, a bit more tangible. As I've said already, responding, doing all the things that we're going to have to do is hugely complex, and that's part of the overwhelming bit. Well, I've taken quite a lot of thinking from project management, in the world of project management, in terms of how you break things down into bite-sized chunks. When you think of organizing the Olympics or something like that, day one, they probably sit and they think, crikey, this is overwhelming, it's huge, it's complex. But project management has over the years found ways of doing these highly complex things. This is one of the wonders of humanity, that we have that ability to collaborate and to dish work out amongst teams. Our ability to organize is, for me, one of the great wonders of the world. And I suppose that's why I became an organization psychologist. So, quick whiz into some pages of the book. I'm not going to linger here, but there's a couple of pages which begin to talk about this finding your resolve and finding your motivation. Here's a couple of pages which talk around focus, and particularly try to get very clear about the goal. And I'll come back to that more. Here's some pages which are about measuring. So you can see here that I'm helping people to go through in a systematic way, because for many people, the kind of concepts like kilowatt hours, they hear about a kilowatt hour and they'd run a mile. And actually having your hand held a bit, using a checklist like this, taking time to go through it slowly, using some online help is part of the measuring process. For me, crucial, because that helps you as an individual household to see your personal pollution, as I call it, and to particularly then see where the biggest polluting is, and therefore where the priority areas are. the idea of not doing it in isolation, and that's where this idea of a carbon buddy came up. It actually came up from talking to a friend about diving. And they said, oh yeah, we have buddies. We have buddies when we go deep sea diving. We have buddies and we work together. And I thought that's what we need. We need people to do it with their friends, you know, rather than struggling all by themselves. So for me, that's one of the building blocks, is doing this with your friends, doing this with your mates, doing this with people you trust, doing this with people who you don't have to argue with too much. You know, keeping it as a supportive environment is hugely important. And then I mentioned about propagation. This is the idea of scaling up. And I go into quite some detail how an individual apart, or a household apart from looking at their own personal pollution or their household's personal pollution, can have a secondary stream of activity where they are propagating, they are drawing in other people, they are inspiring other people. And all of you who are putting your fantastic work into doing local climate actions groups, that's exactly what you're doing. You're propagators. And that's hugely important. And that comes for me from growing vegetables. So that was the origin of that one. And then planning. Well, I've talked about breaking things down into bite-sized chunks. One of the things I realized, not only for myself, but as I talk to other people, is people say, oh, there's so much to do. I must do everything. You know, I've got to start this, I've got to start that, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. Boom, overwhelmed. I said, no, hang on. Whoa, fall back. Break it down into bite-sized chunks, put them at different times, see what the priorities are. And that's one of the ways that you can make it less overwhelming, because you're doing it in phases, you're doing it in stages. You're completing one bit and then you're moving on to the next. So a much more, a feeling of being in control of the process, which is hugely important. Okay, so that's a quick, very quick insight into the manual. And now I want to move on and just give you some thoughts for climate action groups. How are we doing on time? Okay, 10:39. I'll go through this and then probably stop. I won't do the whole thing in terms of detail, and leave it open for questions, and I can come back and fill out some of this. I just got one word, right? Focus. And this comes from all of my professional career, and it also comes from the experiences of the last 12 years of us trying to do things. Focus, focus, focus. Let me say some more. Focus in the following ways. Number one, think emergency, right? There's this glib talk about the climate emergency, but do we see people behaving as if it's emergency? We don't. So what would it mean to think emergency? It's a mindset thing, number one. Number two, the clarity of the goal. Number three, the focus on short-term impacts. What is actually going to make the biggest difference in the shortest period of time? That's another kind of focus. Next one, think local. As a local action group, I really would suggest and advise you, and I don't give advice very much if I can help it, but work within the area that you know, where you have your networks, where you are, where you can amplify the local skills and make visible the local skills. That is where you're likely to be able to make the most significant difference, rather than trying to change the whole world. People who try to change the whole world usually end up exhausted. And then I'll say a little bit about structure and how to structure a group. And then I'm going to say something about distraction. So I'm going to just go through each of those in a little bit more detail, but very quickly. And it'll be too quick. But then I'll stop and leave some space for questions. So when I was writing the manual, it was at the time, if you remember it, when that young Thai football team were trapped in the underground cave, which was flooded. And the world watched, gripped, as the rescuers went about the process of rescuing those kids and their coaches out of that cave. It was the most extraordinary piece of rescue work. And I thought, I was very struck. That was an emergency. I mean, it really was an emergency, but I was very struck by the calm and the sense of hope and the sense of very careful planning that went on. There was a huge amount of planning that went on, but then they acted incredibly fast, working as a team and working with incredible courage and persistence. I think we can learn from those sorts of people, because the scale of this emergency is something beyond any of our experience. It's beyond the world's experience. And so if we can learn from people who deal with these extraordinary situations of which they don't necessarily have experience before, then I think that's a helpful thing. I've said this already, but I'm going to say it again. This goal, rapid, substantial, local emissions reduction. For me, that is what we have to focus on. Okay? That is what we have to focus on. And I picked out, not at random, but what I call the big 5 significant impacts. And they're to do with decarbonizing buildings. So that's the heating in our homes, but it's also office blocks or any other buildings that you find yourselves going into. If you belong to a sports club, then that's a building that has heating and has or cooling or has good insulation or bad insulation or whatever it may be. This is probably, certainly in the UK, and I suspect maybe less so in the States, for example, this is a huge challenge. And the government has already had 2 attempts to do things and to provide financial help, and they've been disasters. Apparently another one is about to be announced next week. We'll see if they've managed to get it right. But one of the reasons why they didn't get it right was because they didn't understand the obstacles involved in people getting new insulation, the obstacles involved in buying or getting hold of an air source heat pump. I've just been through the process. Literally last week, we had an air source heat pump installed. It's been the last part of our jigsaw, but it's taken me 2 years to really think it through and to get the right solution and. Right, decarbonizing holidays. Well, you know what word lies within that, of course, FLY. That's a biggie, but it's not a biggie for everybody. It's a biggie for those who fly a lot. So that's got to be the starting place, people who fly a lot. But it doesn't mean that everybody shouldn't also reduce flying if they do fly. Personal transport, I'd use that phrase rather than electric cars, which is what Boris Johnson used today. It's too narrow. It's about transport. For me, one of my most exciting things of the last couple of years is the electric bike, and how in many situations, having an electric bike probably removes the need for a car, depending on where you live. So, there's some very exciting technologies coming along in that whole electric transport sphere, both from, electric lorries down to electric buses, down to electric scooters and bicycles, down to electric cars. But electric is the key, apart from walking, of course. Food consumption. Well, we get a lot of stuff about cutting down on meat. Vegan food has exponentially grown. But for me, there's something not only about the meat thing or the non-meat thing, it's about food miles. And that's sort of gone off the radar a little bit. Yesterday was my birthday, and my 2 lovely sons gave me a liquidizer thing for making smoothies, right? They said that my breakfast was unhealthy and therefore I needed to have more smoothies for my breakfast. So I said, that's great. And I started reading the manual. You can't just make a smoothie, there's a manual. And there's the antioxidant smoothies and there are the low calorie smoothies, and crikey, I felt like I was reading a textbook. But what did I see in there? The most common ingredients in the smoothies, right? Avocados, pineapples, mangoes, kiwi fruits, guavas. What do they have in common? They all travel a very long way to get to our tables and to get into our supermarkets. They're essentially tropical fruits and they have very high food mile thing, even bananas. Now, for me, that's the second angle in there that we ought to be thinking about. And then I'm going to add in one other, which is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. And it was started off hearing of a friend, this was pre-pandemic, organizing a wedding for 200 of their closest friends, where all of those 200 people, these people lived in the UK, they were flying to Barbados for the wedding, and they were going to stay there for a week, and then they were going to fly back. And that set me thinking, gosh, what carbon footprint has that got? And then, of course, we have the Tokyo Olympics. And they made a good shot, didn't they, at trying to make them low carbon. But they were let off the hook because, of course, not very many people flew from all over the world to go to the Olympics. And then we'll have the Football World Cup, which was also couldn't quite go off as it had done in years past. But I suddenly thought these mass events where the assumption is that huge numbers of spectators will fly halfway across the world for the events. And I suppose we learned during the pandemic, didn't we? That actually you can stage them without all that flying, not the same, but I found that rather thought-provoking. Thinking local, moving on very quickly, using the local skills in your area, build the visibility of the skills in your area. I was talking to the guy who installed my heat pumps here. I said, you know, what's the situation like in your industry? He said, there's an incredible shortage of good people. And it's difficult to market ourselves. And they are there, but they need to be made more visible. And we also need a lot more training. We need to be in touch with the local training schools and training and colleges about training people rapidly for these new green roles. Is that happening? I'm not sure that it is. Your structure, I found a very effective structure is one where you have a small core group of people and a number of satellites, what I call satellites or hubs. The small core group, in a sense, keeps the whole thing on track. They make sure that everything is to do with that goal we've talked about, and they manage some of the distractions. The small satellites, usually driven by a champion who cares about a particular topic, they're the ones who are driving the action. So, for example, you might, for these ones that I've talked about up here, you know, you might have a group, a satellite that's talking about buildings in your area. What strategy can we do for improving the current buildings? What can we do on transport? So that each of those could, for example, be a satellite with a small group that's focusing on that, and then the local, the central group, or whatever we're going to call it, the small core group doing the other stuff. And then finally, distractions. I'm afraid that in this world of climate and environment, because the two sometimes get put together, there are quite often a large number of egos and a lot of the egos are in it for their own personal passions. They see a climate action group, for example, as a vehicle for what they are personally interested in. And if you're not careful, they can actually hijack that group and set it off course and take it away from that crucial goal that I talked about. And I'm afraid I call it the Attenborough effect, because the words climate change and environment have somehow got meshed together. And people think if I'm doing something environmental, I'm doing something to reduce carbon emissions, or I'm doing something for climate change. That is not necessarily the case. Okay, sometimes if you're doing something environmental, if you want to rescue polar bears or whatever your particular environmental passion might be, or even plastic, you might argue, picking up plastic, it's treating the symptoms, but it's not treating the cause. Now, I would never be somebody who says you shouldn't be doing that. But what I would say is, if you are putting all of your energy and your passion into doing something environmental that is not having a direct impact on reducing your personal carbon emissions, if it's taking up all your time and energy, then is that the right choice? That's a really difficult thing to say because people feel so strongly about the environment, and I can understand why. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say for the moment. Let's open it up. I can only be the spark in this process. You guys are the flames. You're the ones who are actually doing it. You're the ones who can prioritize. You're the ones who can propagate. You're the ones who can draw resources together in your local areas. But whatever you do, my plea is, because it's an emergency, we need to move beyond talking. There's too much talking in this movement. We have to now act, and act fast. So let's have some Q&As, and I'll hand back. Let me stop share. No, can I stop? Do I stop sharing at this point, Omar, do you think?
Yeah, if you'd like to, so that people could see each other. If you wanted to keep it up.
Okay, there we go. I'll do that. Right, let me hand back to you, Omar.
Brilliant. Thank you for that very inspiring talk. There was much that you said that I personally agreed with. I'm going to open it up to the floor. If anyone had a question, if your camera is on, please feel free to just put your hands up. Oh, yeah, there's quite a few clapping hand emojis, which I completely agree with. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put up your hands, either your actual hands or using the little hand emoji in the reactions button at the bottom. Does anyone have any questions?
Raising my hand.
Oh,
This is
sorry.
John here. I really enjoyed that. Colin and I have talked before. I've not heard his talk about the book completely. I'm interested, just a quick question about, I'm struck that I think it's important to listen and not talk. And then you were talking about action, is that so much is talking to people. You do this, you do that. You know, it's all about telling somebody what to do. And even now, I think this comes off a lot. I subscribe to a lot of the news, and they're almost always berating somebody for something. And I'm wondering, from your experience, and you obviously be from a British, you know, what do I say, UK, Britain, you know, from that corner of the world, is any insights that you've garnered that might be useful for us in this space?
Well, you're aware of what I think is the best around, which is the work of climate outreach. Mm-hmm. And in fact, John, you sent me a link to it, but I had come across it. Just for those of you who are not aware of it, there's an organization in Oxford called Climate Outreach. And some while ago, probably 18 months ago, they published a online, it's a free of charge PDF that you can download, about having climate conversations with people and the difficult conversations. And in that, they've taken a lot of the learnings from coaching skills, counseling skills, the listening skills that you so rightly allude to, John, because key to that business about understanding and obstacles is coaching, counseling type skills to draw out of people what the obstacles are. And that involves the ability to listen, the ability to ask good questions, and not the ability to tell people what to do. That's absolutely the last thing that we want to do. And literally last week, and I haven't had a chance to look at it, they've published a follow-up, which I'm sure is on their website too. They've done a lot of focus groups, and they've identified, I think, 9 different sort of segments, different types of people with different needs in the climate change space. And they're talking about different strategies for engaging with those different groups of people. So that is the only one that I'm aware of. And frankly, it's the only one you need. It's very good. And it's there.
Thanks.
Don't reinvent the wheel. That's another thing. That's another thing we need to stop doing, is reinventing the wheel. Everybody's trying to reinvent the wheel, or my approach, or whatever, including me, of course. Linda, I think sorry, I'm being the chair, which I shouldn't be. Omar.
Oh, please go ahead.
No.
Colin, do you know if this is being used in any cities around anywhere? I think this might be something that our city of Boise would be really interested in hearing about and using.
When you say this is being used, the
manual.
Well, a certain Mr. John Warren is using it in Boise. John,
just get in there.
Tell us a little bit about what you're planning in Boise, because you've done some great stuff getting this off the ground there.
Well, we're just talking, and Linda's been, and I've actually talked to her group, the Citizens Climate Lobby, that she's the lead for here in Idaho. And just, this is more, Linda and I just made a note to call you because I'd like to talk to somebody. Boise actually has a climate plan. I mean, we're very advanced, and our mayor is very on this, and of talking about this for our city, either through the youth or something like that. So I'll ping you afterwards to see, maybe you might have better contacts than me. And then the other thing we're doing, Colin, as you know, we're having a group through the Boise Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, of whom has a climate action team that has a fair number of people on this group, is on the call today. And we're going to have a 4-part session to introduce people to the CBM. And that first thing is going to be in October. And then we'll see if that spawns other things from that. So that's as far as we've gotten so far.
But I think, sorry, come back.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's being used in other cities or towns that you know of.
That I know of. I wouldn't say cities. I think city is too big a unit, depending on the sort of governmental structure. For me, I think a smaller entity or a subsection of a city, an area, or I mean, Croydon is an interesting example. For those of you in the States, you won't know, but Croydon is, well, how do you describe Croydon nowadays, Omar, in relation to
So Croydon is a borough in London. Until recently, it was the largest borough in terms of populations. We have a population of about 380,000 people. So of London's 32 boroughs, we are now the second largest. It's very, very mixed in terms of, I suppose, classes is the best description. You have the much more affluent south of the borough compared to the more industrial centre and north, which is more working class. And that also relates to availability of green space, access to nature, levels of education in terms of climate action as well. So with Croydon Climate Action, we're trying to be quite proactive about including people who aren't normally part of the conversation when it comes to climate change and climate action. So I was actually, what you were saying earlier about local action, I think is the best, especially when you mentioned a small group, you know, sort of almost like a central core, and then having spokes coming off that group, which is actually what we're We've slowly, it's taken some time, but we're slowly doing that. We've got groups in the north, groups in the south, and we're able to connect people by really simple things like WhatsApp. People are able to connect with each other and learn from each other, and actually learn how to take action in their local area and sort of be inspired. So yeah, that sort of spoke to me quite a bit.
Yes.
Well, that gives me some, sorry, can I just say, that gives me some ideas, because Boise is organized into neighborhood associations. The city keeps sending out, you know, we want you to be involved, but I think a lot of people are stuck or overwhelmed. But that idea that Croydon's using is maybe something we could use here, is to take this idea into smaller groups around in neighborhoods. So thank you for sharing that.
And people identify with that, you know. They have their networks in those local areas. They've got friendship networks, you know, as the core of it. But then they will also have networks of people with relevant skills. They'll have networks into the local schools. You know, it's somehow more within their everyday experience. But a slightly different answer to your question is around, I mean, I started off here. Cornwall is what we call a county. So it's the nearest equivalent to what you call in the state a state, except our counties are obviously much smaller in terms of geographical size and people. And so we have what's called a county council, which is a political and also an executive role in doing all sorts of elements. And for me, as I observe what's happened at that county council level, as opposed to what's happened at the local town and even village level, it's the towns and the villages that seem to me to actually be making things happen at a faster rate, because they don't have all that baggage of policies and procedures and, you know, having to get lots of different political people on board. They've declared a climate emergency, but I think it's really difficult if you're a politician at that level to really generate, particularly in a democratic system, to generate that level of buy-in and rapid action, which you can much more easily do in a smaller local area. That's my feeling. I'd like to, can I bring in Emma here? Because Emma, you've got a lot of experience of helping people, I think, haven't you, in Cornwall, for example? How have you gone about it?
And we do all sorts of things really, but with our main customer base, if you like, our main client base are people experiencing fuel poverty.
Okay.
So we help them to get emergency measures, but also looking at long-term solutions as well. And we're also covering renewables. So we're looking into getting heat pumps and things to people, you know, and people interested in that. But I think they're two diverse sets of clients. And I think one thing that we are very concerned about is people experiencing fuel poverty are really difficult. I mean, there's choices, you know, you may have heard heat or eat recently, and it's very, very much like that and has been for a while. There is a whole different side to Cornwall that the tourists don't really see. And so it's our job really to get that help to people, particularly concerning their energy. We've also, I mean, we have recently set up a team that help people who are suffering from mental health issues, who also have energy problems, and the two are just, you know, not helping each other, if you like. So if you sort one problem out, generally it can be sorted out.
Okay.
So, you know, whilst we would like to promote our renewables, and we are doing that, but we also would like a way of really empathizing with the householder, the general householder in Cornwall, who may be below the poverty line. They may be, you know, just managing, or they may be managing very well. And I think part of my job is really to help inform people via social media as to what initiatives are out there at the moment, what people can do. And I think generally people in Cornwall do want to make a difference. They do see, the things that need changing, and they are very good at changing things. But I think there are some people who we perceive that they're not in the situation to change things because they are literally in survival mode, if you like.
One of the things, sorry to cut across you there. One of the things that I've tried very hard in the book is to hit on head on this issue of people's financial resources or lack of them. There's actually a section in the book called "On Finance or Lack of It," and the line I found myself taking as I talked to people was to say, yes, obviously a lot of this costs a lot of money, and I'm lucky. I will say I'm lucky to have been able to use some of my money to do this stuff. And people who don't have that level of finance resources can still do some things which don't involve money. It involves their energy, it involves their networks. Everybody has networks locally, so part of my objective was to try to, I'm not very keen on this word, but try to empower everybody to feel that they could do something. And it doesn't necessarily involve money. Right.
I think, sorry, can I just, I think what we'd like to do is set something up, perhaps a Facebook group or something like that, where we issue the manual to volunteers. So across all housing tenures, across all different incomes, a whole sort of range of people, and we can use it so that they can monitor their progress in how the manual is helping them, regardless of income, regardless of situation. And I'm just really wondering if there's anything else similar that's been set up already. So where the manual's been issued and the progress has been, again, because it's a collaborative thing, they could actually, report on the group how things are going. They can get support from each other. They can involve families and friends and that sort of thing. And it can be on that local basis.
Can we talk offline about that? But yes, within Cornwall, Helston and Bude, for example, are doing some really interesting things along those lines. But let's talk about that separately.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Cornwall to take over this international dialogue. I think Dennis there is trying to attention. Dennis, I think you're
on mute.
Dennis, are you on? It doesn't say mute, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Is your volume turned up? Maybe you're on mute. Oh, I think your volume is probably turned down.
Gonna get there.
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that I really have enjoyed about the manual, and I'm about halfway through, it seems to count, at least for us in Boise and a few of the groups that I'm associated with, is the combination of the drawdown book and as well as the carbon footprint. And you get into the chapters 3 and 4 and 5, and you start getting into that. And one of the things that I think that one of the groups that I'm associated with that has been very good is that in looking at our carbon footprint and coming up with some goal is that it starts to build community. And it seems that community aspect is very, very important, no matter what your income level or where you are, you're at. And it allows for that conversation. Now, what we haven't done yet, as your manual is alluded to, is sit down with a carbon buddy partner and have that conversation, because I think that would be excellent in terms of opening up. Because I remember doing the carbon footprint a couple of years ago, and then I went back through after looking at the manual, and so I went back and did it again, and I can't remember what I did 2 years ago. But I thought to myself, okay, now it also gave me an opportunity to go back and make adjustments. And I said, how fun would this be, or interesting, to sit down with anyone and just share what we found and look for ways to take action. So anyway, that's my comment. I think it was a good manual.
That's a lovely way of thinking about it, because it is. And don't be too stuck in the notion of the pair. You know, it's an idea in a sense as much as a reality. I think somewhere in there I say, well, go up to a maximum of 4 in a group of buddies. You know, so if there's somebody else who wants to come in and be part of it, then don't say, well, you're not a pair, you know. But I suggest you don't go more than 4, because then you start, group dynamics start getting in the way, and people don't have enough airtime in a meeting. Yeah, so it's again this satellite side. You know, build lots of little satellites, and as Omar said, you know, you can connect those satellites together with Facebook. As Emma was saying, there's all these tools now, like Zoom, to connect people together. It's potentially very powerful.
Brilliant. It looks like no one has any other questions. So if everyone could just join me for a quick round of applause.
And, you know, to Omar and Catherine and your group there in Croydon, and to Connie, thank you so much for making this happen. I'm so grateful to you. And thanks to all of the rest of you who have come from various parts of the world to join us. And if we could organize for this recording to be made available, John, I think we have the answer to your 2 o'clock in the morning problem. John sent an email the other day. He said, do you think, how would you feel about doing a presentation at 7 p.m. Croydon time, 2 a.m. BST? He said. I said, it's not my liveliest moment.
Don't you want to be my carbon buddy?
But I did suggest that maybe a recording would be the way. So would it be okay if we shared that with John in the States so that he could show it to other people? Are people okay with that? This is your...
Yeah, I'm sure that's fine. It's fine with me.
Okay, well, if you could send me the link and stuff, that would be brilliant.
Brilliant. Okay.
Well,
Thank
nice to meet you all, and thanks for your time.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, and have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
Whatever it is.
Right.
And Omar, will I see you on Saturday, or will you be there on Saturday?
Catherine will be doing Saturday morning. I'll be running a different event.
Brilliant. Okay, cheers everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone. Have a lovely
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.